All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Jesse Hildebrand, and I'm with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those who don't know, we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Today, we're joined by 4 classes from across North America. I'm going to give them a chance to do a big shout out. So first, we have Mrs. Plant's class from Kirkland Lake, Ontario, grade 3s. Awesome. We have Mrs. Sinclair's grade 2-3s from Kalispell, Montana. All right, we need Montana to represent for KT. All right, we've got Mrs. Trevino's class, grade 4 from San Antonio. Yes. We've got Mrs. Milliger's class, grade 7s from Austin, Texas. And then just joining us a second ago, we have Mrs. Lynch's grade 4 class from Kalispell, Montana. If you guys want to, yeah, there you go. You can yell. Awesome. We have all the Montana classes. All right. So, of course, you guys are not here for me today. You're here for KT. KT Miller is an adventure photographer, which means she gets to go all around the world to the most exciting and amazing places and document the story there for everyone else to share. So that's just the coolest job in the world, and I can't possibly explain it better than she can. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us here today, KT.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. I'm super excited to be here with you today. So glad we have so many of you. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull up some photos here while we chat today. So I'm talking to you right now from a teeny tiny town in Montana called Cook City, and you can see it's that red dot right there. And it is on the border of Yellowstone National Park. So it's just outside the park boundary, up on the top right corner there. And there's only about 100 people that live in the town that I live in. It's tiny, tiny. And the coolest thing about it is that we are surrounded on all sides by mountains and wild landscapes. So Yellowstone National Park on one side and national forests on the other sides. And we have lots of wildlife. So some of you might know who this is or what this is. Raise your hand if you've ever seen one of these. It's a bison, right? So they live in Yellowstone National Park, and occasionally they wander a little bit outside of the park, and we see them in the town that I live in. So I really love wild landscapes, wildlife, animals. It's really, just become a huge part of my life and what I'm passionate about. So I'm going to rewind a little bit and basically tell you my story and how I ended up doing what I'm doing today. I work as a professional photographer, skier, and writer. So that's what I do for a living. And I'm super, super lucky, and I work really hard to make all of that possible. So I grew up in Bozeman, Montana, which some of you folks in Kalispell have maybe visited there. And I always say that I was really, really spoiled because my parents loved to take me to do things outside. So I was about 6 years old in this picture. I was probably in first grade, and skiing at our local ski hill, Bridger Bowl. And my dad loved to ski. He always took me skiing. So as a little kid, I really learned how to have fun outside, and I didn't realize that would become really an important part of my life at the time. I was just having fun. I really enjoyed it. So that's me and my dad. We ski together all the time, and skiing really took over my life. It's kind of what my friends and I love to do. We did it all the time. Every free moment we had, we were out skiing. And my dad and I still ski together today. So this is my dad and I skiing outside Cook City, where I live now. So in high school, I also really started to fall in love with photography. And maybe some of you are like me. I've always been a very visual person. So when I was in school, I always loved the projects where maybe you had to design a poster, or you were painting or drawing. And so photography, I just really fell in love with it when I was in high school. And at that time, we were still shooting with film cameras. So this was before digital. But it was all just great to start playing with light and shapes and colors. And so these are a few of my very first photographs that I ever took. And I was only about maybe 12 or 13 years old, so I wasn't that much older than you guys. And I still remember these pictures today vividly. And so after high school, I went to college, and we were still skiing all the time. And I was in college for photography because I loved pictures. And so I was taking photos, skiing with my friends, trying to learn as much as I could. And I really just started realizing how many wild places there were that I could go explore. You know, I started picking up maps and trying to fill in the blanks of these places I would see on a map, but I wanted to see it with my eyes in real life and put an image to that place on the map. And I started taking a lot of pictures of skiing. And while I was in college, I started selling some of my photos of skiing. So I would sell them to maybe a magazine or a company that makes skis, or they make jackets or hats. And I realized that, you know, I was in college and I had a bunch of student loans, and I was already making a living as a photographer. So one summer, I did an expedition to Bolivia, which is in South America. And this expedition was really life-changing for me. I was kind of assistant guiding, and we were climbing mountains down there, but we were also interacting with the culture. And it was the first time I had been in a culture where people really, just day after day, their main focus is just trying to get their next meal on the table. So I realized how lucky and how privileged I was living in Montana in the United States, where, you know, I wasn't really worried about where my next meal was coming from, or what I was going to eat for dinner that night. So it really just gave me a little more perspective on the world. And after that, I decided it was time to kind of pursue photography more vigorously, more intentionally. And I came home and I kept photographing skiing and was selling more pictures. And I decided I better maybe try to go to Alaska. So I went up there to guide heli skiing. And that wasn't really my thing. It was a little too fast for me. I like going slower. I like being able to really think about where I am and see the mountains, and just I like moving a little slower in the mountains. But what I did learn in Alaska was that there are all these amazing wild places on the earth that I could go explore and experience and discover. And then I could bring those stories back to share with people and share how special and inspiring these places are. So on my way home from Alaska that year, I called up a mentor of mine. And this mentor works with polar bears in the Arctic. And I called her up and I said, you know, hey, I'm on my way home from Alaska, and I'm not sure what I'm doing this fall, but I know you work with polar bears, and is there any chance that maybe I could do some work for you? And she said, yes, absolutely. Your first assignment is that I'm going to send you to Svalbard to take photographs for us. And I was just blown away, like, whoa, you're going to send me to Svalbard? That's crazy. And so as you can see on this map, Svalbard is an archipelago. And an archipelago, as some of you may know, is a group of islands. So it's a group of islands in between Greenland and Scandinavia. So Norway, Sweden, Finland, and it's in the Arctic Circle. And it's a super wild place. So I already knew I loved wild places and I loved mountains, but it was in Svalbard that I really started to fall in love with animals. And some of you out there are probably going, oh, I love animals. I have a dog or a cat, and you know, I just love animals. So that's where I really started to fall in love with animals. And this photo is an Arctic tern feeding its chick. And I sat in this area for about 3 hours trying to take this picture. And I finally got the image that I was hoping for. And while I was taking these pictures, I was also learning so much about the Arctic and about animals and ecosystems. And this bird travels all the way from the Arctic to the Antarctic every single year. So from the North Pole to the South Pole. And it chases summer. So it comes to the North Pole for summer there, and then it goes to the South Pole for summer there. So they're amazing birds. And also Brunix guillemot, which is kind of, it's related to a penguin. I'm sure a lot of you know what penguins are. So there's no penguins in the North Pole. They're only in the South Pole. But in the Northern Hemisphere, we do have birds that are close relatives to penguins. So these guys were super funny and fun to photograph and watch. Just beautiful birds. And these, as many of you know, are Arctic foxes. And I'm sure lots of you have seen foxes where you live, maybe red foxes. So these are the ones that live in the Arctic, and they turn white in the winter, and then they change colors in the summer. And just, again, beautiful creatures. So I really started falling in love with animals in Svalbard. And this was on the most northern part of Svalbard, and it is a picture of the sea ice. So a lot of you may know this, but on the South Pole, there's land that's covered by ice. But on the North Pole, there's no land. It's an ocean that's frozen. So there's no land underneath, frozen ocean. And what's amazing is that this frozen ocean has all sorts of plants and animals and an entire ecosystem that all depends on ice. And of course, one of my favorite animals that relies on this ecosystem is, maybe some of you can guess it. Anybody guess? A polar bear. So this was the very first polar bear that I ever saw. And I was so amazed that this animal could live in such a harsh Arctic environment. And polar bears hunt seals. So that is the main thing they eat. They eat seals because seals have a lot of fat. An adult seal has about 30% of its body is fat, and a baby seal can have up to 70% of its body that's fat. So polar bears, they use their noses to sniff out where there might be a hole in the sea ice. And that hole is often a breathing hole for a seal. Seals swim around in the water, and then they have to come up through the hole to get air because they're a mammal. Like us, they need air to breathe. So the polar bears will go hang out at the breathing hole and wait for a seal to come take a breath, and then they'll catch it, pull it up on the ice, and that's their dinner. So polar bears are very, very, very dependent on the sea ice. They can't live on land. And it was crazy to be up in Svalbard and see that the sea ice that they depended on was melting. So ice became a big theme of my trip to Svalbard, and I learned about all different types of ice. So there's sea ice, which is frozen ocean water, like we just saw. And this is glacial ice. So this is ice covering land that's been frozen for thousands and thousands of years. And it's just absolutely incredible to think how old the ice is and how young we humans are. There was also an ice cap. So this is, it's a big permanent piece of ice that covers land, and it stretches out into the ocean a ways, and it calves into the ocean. So this is the Ostfauna ice cap. It's the second largest ice cap in the world. And it was absolutely stunning to watch the waterfalls just pouring off of it as it melted in the summertime. And one of the craziest things about my trip to Svalbard that summer was we were traveling in a boat, and the captain of the boat was steering when we were near this ice cap. And I went up to say hello, and he showed me the map of where we were, and he said, you know, last year, where we are sailing right now, the ice cap was here. So the ice cap had receded. It had melted and shrunk over a mile in just 1 year. So it was pretty crazy to think about how much and how fast it was melting. And that trip, I really started kind of connecting the dots between my love for wild places, a love for animals and the environment, and realizing that humans were having a really big impact on it. And in a lot of ways, the impact I was seeing was the greenhouse gas emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere that are melting ice in the Arctic. And that has a huge impact on an entire ecosystem. Polar bears, seals, birds, whales, all sorts of animals that live up there, as well as indigenous people that use those things for their way of life. And I also started to see some other smaller impacts that humans, you know, sometimes you don't think that something you do might have a really big impact, but we came up on this beach there, and the beach was covered in trash, and there's no human settlements within thousands of miles of this beach. And so all this trash had floated up from Russia. And it was wild for me to realize and to think, okay, if I threw a pop bottle in the ocean off the east coast of the United States, it could float all the way up to a beach in the Arctic. And that realization made me understand that the world is a little smaller than we sometimes think it is, and that we as individuals have an ability to impact really faraway places, even with our small everyday actions that we take. So that fall, I then went up to Churchill, Manitoba, again to work with polar bears for this organization called Polar Bears International. And some of you in Canada may know where Churchill is, and maybe some of you in Texas and Montana do too. So it's up on Hudson Bay, and it's known as the polar bear capital of the world. And I grew up in Montana where there's mountains everywhere. So when I got to Churchill, I was really overwhelmed because it was flat everywhere. And I sort of thought, oh my, I am going to go crazy because it's so flat here and I'm so used to hills and mountains. And I thought, this place is really empty. There's nothing here because it's flat. And over time, the more and more time I spent up there, I realized that flat did not mean empty. And in fact, the landscape was so full. There was so much there. And I started to see, you know, the rock that the Arctic hare has his home underneath, and the tree that the snowy owl likes to perch in and look for prey, and all these little things that started to kind of appear out of this seemingly flat landscape. And I also saw polar bears, but the big difference was there was no sea ice. So in Churchill, most of the sea ice melts in July. And then those bears that live out on the sea ice and need sea ice to hunt seals are forced to swim to shore, and they just sort of hang out and wait for the sea ice to form again. So they swim to shore sometime in July, and then they wait for August, September, October, and then sometime in November, the sea ice forms again. And these bears pretty much fast, meaning they don't eat anything the whole time they're waiting on shore. So sure, they might find a goose egg here or chew on a piece of seaweed there, but for a polar bear, that's like eating a gummy bear. Do you think you could live off of a gummy bear for a whole month? I don't think so. Yeah, so seals are like having like 12 hamburgers for a polar bear. They need like a big meal. And they can't survive just off of eating a couple gummy bears here and a couple gummy bears there. So fortunately, most of them will make it through this period of fasting, but as the ice melts more and more, and that period of time gets longer and longer, it's becoming really hard for the polar bears. So as soon as there's any sign of ice, the bears go out and they start testing the ice, and they're hoping to catch seals. So what I do up there is I work on this tundra buggy for Polar Bears International. And so this is like a school bus on monster truck wheels, as you can see. And I have an amazing colleague there, and he and I work together to rig wireless internet onto this buggy. So we run all these wires, and we program radios and antennas so that we can have wireless internet. And then just like you and I are doing right now, we do webcasts. And I know some of you will have an opportunity to webcast with them this fall. So I help install the cameras and run the cameras and do the things like Jesse's doing for this, where I'm starting the live broadcasts and working with the scientists. So they bring scientists onto the buggy, and BJ and I, my coworker, we work together to webcast with people all over the world and share the story of the polar bears here. And we also learn about lots of other Arctic wildlife. So this is a fox. It's not an Arctic fox. It's actually a red fox, but they can have different colors. And we have polar bear specialists, but we also have other scientists that come up. So sometimes we have a snowy owl scientist who will come up, and we have people who study sea ice and people who study the climate, all sorts of different experts that we get to work with. And at the end of the day, it's all about sharing the story of these guys, the polar bears. So when I'm not up in the Arctic working on that sort of thing, then I spend most of my time doing other adventurous photography expeditions. And one of the coolest expeditions that I have ever been on that I'm going to tell you about is a trip where we went to Greenland. So 6 girls, we all decided that we wanted to do a big expedition, a big trip. And we wanted to go skiing, and we wanted to do some scientific research, and we wanted to share a story about climate change. So we decided that we would sail from Iceland to Greenland and ski as many mountains as we could along the way. That was our goal. And there's us 6 gals. So we all had different jobs for the expedition. I was the photographer, and I also shot the video. And then we had someone who was in charge of maps and route finding, someone who was in charge of all the logistics, so figuring out the boat, figuring out what kind of, how big of a boat we needed and how many people it would hold and what we would eat. We had another person in charge of kind of marketing and how to share our story. We had a writer, and we had another person that was in charge of the budget, so keeping track of all the money, the finances. And our first day skiing in Iceland was very challenging. As you can see, it was super windy, and it took, all of our energy and our skills and talents to safely ski and navigate through the mountains. And we would get on and off the boat with this little Zodiac. It's like a raft with a motor. So we'd drop anchor with the sailboat, hop in the Zodiac, take the Zodiac to shore to ski, and same thing on the return. And it was an absolutely stunning trip, but it was also the most difficult trip I've ever done and ever been on, and it required every skill that I have spent my life building and learning and becoming a skier and photographer. And we saw some pretty incredible impacts of climate change, especially in the small communities in Greenland. And I won't go into too much more detail for the sake of time, but we did make a documentary, and it is free online. So if you think, oh, that's something cool that I would like to see, you can ask your parents and just type it into Google, and it's free on the internet for anyone to watch. And so since then, I've done lots of other expeditions to Alaska and Romania and Norway and Italy and Slovenia, and tried to share these stories of skiing, of wild places, and also of my home in Montana, because where I live here is amazing too. And I continue to return to Churchill every year. I've been going for 5 years now. We'll see how much longer I'll be able to go. It's a really exhausting and time-committing job, but it's also very rewarding. And working with, lots of amazing people from across the spectrum of conservation, of adventure, and science, to try to work towards, a healthy planet for you guys and for, your children's children. Trying to think that far ahead, believe it or not. And yeah, so the work I do really, I try to combine my two loves, my love of conservation and wild places in the Arctic, and my love of skiing and mountains. And a few of the organizations I've partnered with and work with are Protect Our Winters. They really work on climate change activism in the ski community. Winter Wildlands Alliance, they're working a lot on protecting public lands so that we can visit them when they're snow covered. And Polar Bears International. For the sake of climate change and trying to make a better future for our planet and preserve, these wild places that I love to play and share, and they're important too. Snow becomes water, and water is essential for all functions of life on Earth. So as much as it seems silly sometimes to be protecting snow for the sake of skiing, it's really protecting snow so that we have clean, fresh drinking water, and animals and plant species and ecosystems have the water that they need to thrive and to survive. So the future is always unknown, but one thing I've learned over the years is that nothing is impossible. No matter how crazy or outrageous or ridiculous an idea might seem, there's almost always a way. And you know, when we decided we wanted to sail from Iceland to Greenland and ski along the way, a lot of people told us, you know, that would be impossible. And so we just had to, you know, slow down and step by step go through the process of figuring it out. Figuring out how to raise the money, figuring out how to read the maps, figuring out how to manage the sailboat. So if we break things down into bite-sized pieces, pretty much nothing is impossible. You just have to figure out how. So I would encourage all of you to follow your curiosity. And whether that is, you know, skiing in wild places across the world, or whether that is, you know, building or technology or cooking or whatever it may be, I find that if I continue to follow my curiosity throughout my life, that it always takes me to interesting and fulfilling places. So that's all for the presentation, and we can move into questions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, KT. Before I go through each one of the classes and get them to ask a question, I know we have quite a few groups watching live on YouTube right now. If you want to submit your questions in the chat bar on the right, please do so, and then I'll ask KT myself. But for the time being, we'll start with Mrs. Plant's class. If you guys have a question, go right ahead.
Okay, so who has a question? Okay, what is your question?
How long did it take you to get here?
To get to
Like, where she is now?
back from the Arctic?
Yeah, like, how did she get, like, how long, like, did it take a year? Did it take a month? How long did it take to get where she is now?
Okay, so how long did it take you to travel to these places is what I think you're asking, correct? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So it depends where you're going, but you know, we live in a pretty amazing world with airplanes where we can go places really fast. So we flew from the United States to Iceland. It only took us a day to fly there. But then when we sailed from Iceland to Greenland, it took us 5 weeks, so more than a whole month to sail there. And then it took us 2 days to fly home again. So we flew from Greenland back to Iceland. That took 1 day. And then we flew from Iceland back home to the United States, and that took another day.
Excellent. All right, so we'll head to Mrs. Sinclair's class. If you guys have a question.
How do you get back up the hill without a chairlift?
That is a really good question. So there's all this new technology. I'm actually going to show you guys my skis. Would you like that? I have a pair right here. So we have these amazing skis. Let me move my chair so you can see. And they have a special binding. I'm going to put my boot in the binding so you can see it. So these skis have boots where you can walk uphill. And we put a skin on the bottom, which is made these days usually out of nylon, but if you think, it's very similar to a seal skin. It's named after animal skins. Or velvet. Have you ever pet velvet? And one way you pet it, it goes smooth, and if you go the other way, it's coarse. So when you go uphill, it's smooth and it slides, and then the coarseness catches. So it allows you to go uphill. It's kind of like you have carpets on the bottom of your skis. And then you use your boot to go uphill with the carpets on the bottom. And then when you get to the top, you can lock your heel in, and it's just like alpine skiing on the way down, like a ski area. So it's pretty cool stuff.
Excellent, and great demonstration too, by the way. Let's go to Mrs. Trevino's class. If you guys have a question, go right ahead. You might need to demute your own microphone. I don't know why it's not working on my computer, but if you guys can click the little microphone button at the top of your screen, then you'll be able to ask a question. There you go.
Go ahead, Diego.
Have you ever encountered like a polar bear on the side, like trying to get to the sea probably, or like trying to swim to get something?
Maybe up close, seen a polar bear?
Yes, I've seen hundreds of polar bears up close, believe it or not. So when we're in those tundra buggies, the big school buses on monster truck wheels, we're very safe from the bears. They can't get into the buggies, but they come right up next to them. So very, very close. And I have seen some polar bears from boats as well, where you're safe because you're on the boat. But we are very, very, very careful to never be on the ground with polar bears. Because polar bears are the top of the food chain. So they're not really afraid of anything. And they're super, super curious. So they will come right up to you and check you out and smell you and sniff you. And so we always try to avoid being in a situation where either a human might get hurt or a bear would get hurt.
Excellent. All right, so Mrs. Milliger's class, I know we were having some audio difficulties earlier, but let's try. If you guys have a question, you can come try if you'd like. Okay, we're still having audio difficulties, but there's a blue chat function in the top left, so if you want to click that at any point and ask a question with that, I can relay it to KT. In the meantime, Mrs. Lynch's class, if you guys want to demute your microphone, you can ask a question. There you go.
How do you have time for 3 things?
Say it there.
3 things: skiing, riding, and photography.
Right, that's a good question. That is kind of a lot of stuff. But I try to combine them into one. So like I'll go on a skiing trip, and while I'm skiing, I have my camera with me and I'm taking pictures while we're skiing. And then I come home and I process the photos and then I do the writing. So, you know, maybe I could do more if I just picked one thing. But I think part of what makes it sort of special is that there's not that many people that are taking pictures while they're skiing. So if you can, you know, find what we'd call a niche, like something that's sort of specific that you can learn to do that not lots and lots of people are good at, you kind of have a specialty. So by having that specialty and doing all 3, instead of focusing on one, I think I'm able to get really unique work and unique opportunities by combining all 3 of those things.
Excellent. All right, so while we were doing the presentation, we had Mrs. Walther's class and indeed the whole school join us. So since they have so many classes in the auditorium, I'm going to have them come up, demute their microphone, and they can ask a few questions. So go right ahead, guys.
Okay, go ahead.
How did she get that job?
I think she can you hear us okay?
Yep.
I don't think you need the mic, just talking to the, but you can stand back so they can see you.
How,
So see, there you go, right there.
Perfect.
how did you get that job, and do you enjoy it?
Yeah. I love my job. I think I have one of the most amazing jobs in the world. And some of the things that I did to get the jobs that I do is I've focused on really always being a lifelong learner. So even when I'm not in school, I always try to be learning. I'm always reading books and reading things on the internet and trying to continuously learn new things that will make me better at the various jobs that I do. And, you know, with technology, we live in an amazing world. So a lot of the work that I do for Polar Bears International on the tundra buggies, I have to teach myself how to do that stuff. There's no books that teach you how to program internet on a tundra buggy. So we do a lot of, you know, learning from watching YouTube videos and trying things and writing down what we're trying and writing down what works and what doesn't work. It's almost like an experiment that you do one time, and then if it doesn't work, you try something different. So I think the biggest thing is just being your own teacher and your own, you know, initiating your own learning to allow you to become skilled at whatever it is that you want to do, whether it's photography or something else. So.
Excellent. All right. So again, Mrs. Walter's class, again, if you want to demute your mic and ask another question, I do mute you every time just to make sure we can hear KT, but go right ahead.
What kind of job, what school did she went to get that job?
Yeah, I did. What school did I go to get the jobs that I do? Well, so I went to high school. I graduated from high school, and then I actually did not finish college. I did 1 year of college in Montana. I went to an inexpensive school in my home state, and I studied photography and photojournalism. And after that, I decided that I didn't want to go into debt to go to school, so I was going to choose to teach myself and to be my own teacher and learn as much as I could. And in a lot of ways, I have sort of a degree in polar bear conservation, you could say, but I didn't go to college for it. I chose to learn it on my own, and I sought out mentorship from people. I asked lots of questions. I sat around with scientists to try to learn what they were saying. And I encourage everyone to go to college, but you don't necessarily have to go about life in the way that most people do. There's a lot of different ways to come to a similar end result. And the most important thing, I think, is to just be a lifelong learner.
Well said. If you have time, KT, can I go back through all the classes and get another question from everyone?
Sure.
Excellent. All right, so we'll go back to Mrs. Plant's class. If you guys have another question, go right ahead.
Well, what could we do maybe to help save the animals? So what could we do as young students in Northern Ontario to help fight climate change and help to save the animals?
That is a great question. So one of the biggest things we all can do is use less energy. So things that use energy are like electronics, like the computer I'm talking to you on. So one thing we can all do is make sure we turn out the lights when we leave the room to save energy. We can unplug electronics when we're not using them. So for example, you could unplug your television when you're not watching it. You could unplug your lamp when you're not using it. Because when those things are plugged in, even if they're not turned on, they're still pulling energy and using energy. The other things we can do is we can not, you guys don't have a lot of choices in what you eat. With adults, we can choose to eat things that take less energy to grow. But what you can choose to do is to not be wasteful. So make sure, you eat your whole lunch, or you save it for later and eat it. So we're not throwing things away, like food that just because we don't feel like eating it. Other things we can do is we can carpool whenever possible. We can walk and ride our bikes instead of driving in a car whenever possible. And you as kids can speak up for the planet and make sure that the adults around you know that you think that animals and wild places are important and that we all need to work to protect them. So I think right now, especially with climate change, there's some kids doing some really important stuff and speaking up for animals and for the planet, and the adults are listening. So I think that's another thing that everybody can do.
Excellent. I'm really glad that question was asked. All right, Mrs. Sinclair's class, if you guys have another question. Yep, you're good.
What's your favorite animal that you took a photo of?
Ooh. That's a hard question. I love all animals, but if I had to pick one, maybe I think I would say an owl. A snowy owl is maybe my favorite. It's pretty amazing how a big bird like that can fly. You know, they have hollow bones and their feathers are light, and yet they're huge. They're almost as, you know, they're about half as big as I am, yet they can still fly. I think they're pretty amazing animals.
So for the Harry Potter fans out there, Hedwig is her favorite animal.
Yeah.
All right, Mrs. Trevino's class, if you guys have another question, come on up. Again, I'm having trouble with your mic, so if you want to demute it, that would be lovely. You're good. You guys are in. Yeah.
The avalanche behind you.
Have you ever seen an avalanche?
Yes. So avalanches are a big thing that we try to avoid with skiing. And for people who don't know what an avalanche is when a big snow slope on a mountain comes crashing down, and it could bury you, and they can be very, very dangerous. So I have done, and one of the things I've done also to do the work I do is I've taken a lot of training courses. And they're not courses that you would go to college for, but they're very specific courses. So I've taken, they call them an Avalanche 1 training and an Avalanche 2 training. And they're about a week long, and you learn the science of avalanches, and you learn how to predict when they might happen and how to avoid being in places where they happen. So I've done a lot of training with that, and I've also done lots of other outdoor training, which again is not like college, but they're specific to doing things in the mountains. So I've done, you know, alpine climbing courses, I've done ski guiding courses, I've done wilderness first aid courses, and I have lots of certifications in these other things. But yes, I've seen some avalanches, but fortunately, I've always been able to predict when they might happen and stay out of the way and stay safe.
Excellent. All right, we'll go back to Mrs. Lynch's class. If you guys have another question, go right ahead.
Why did you decide to go to South America in the first place?
That's a good question. So I did a really cool program when I was a senior in high school. So it was my last year of high school, where it was a free program for high school kids, and they taught us how to rock climb, how to ice climb, and how to backcountry ski. And it was with this organization, a non-profit organization. And that same organization does a similar program for adults. So my teacher for that invited me to come to Bolivia with him. And he said, you know, you can come to Bolivia and you can help teach and guide this Bolivia trip for adults, kind of as like an internship So like an apprenticeship where you follow along with a mentor and you're learning. So he invited me to come down there and help with that course, and that's how I ended up there.
Excellent. And then last but not least, we'll go back to Mrs. Walther's group in New York. If you want to come up and demute your mic, you can ask one more question to KT. So come on up and go right ahead. I wish I could demute you myself, but I can't. So just, yep. There you go.
You can talk.
Yep.
That's the job you wanted.
Is that the job she wanted?
You know, I don't think I ever dreamed that what I do now could be a job. It's not like something you read about in a book, right? Like being a professional skier is a job. So, you know, life it's not always as black and white as it sometimes appears to be. And I think especially in the world we live in today with changing technology, a lot of you will create your own jobs. And that is sort of what I did. So my job didn't exist before I created it. And yeah, so I didn't know I wanted the job because it didn't exist before I kind of made it. And over time, it just sort of evolved and came to be. So it's good. That's why I recommend you follow your curiosity, because you never know where your curiosity might take you and what kind of job might come from just being curious and asking questions and following the things that you know interest you and make you scratch your head a little bit and want to know more.
Outstanding. All right, so we've had a really long hangout. It's been great. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to demute the microphones of all the classes. So Mrs. Plott, Sinclair, Trevino, Walther, if you guys want to say a big thank you to KT, go right ahead, guys. You're all demuted. So thank you. Awesome. All right, so thank you so much for joining us today. We had so many great classes, so many great questions. We hope to have you all exploring by the seat of your pants again soon. And KT, thank you so much for a great hangout.
Thank you guys. Stay curious.
Awesome. All right, guys. Have a